known it was going to be the first wish of mine that came true, I would have aimed a lot higher.
It's a yes or no question. When you came to Chicago, were you hoping for a confrontation with the police?
Who was actually responsible for the violence, the protesters, or the police? Did Judge Hoffman really order Bobby Seale to be tied up and silenced in the courtroom? And were the Chicago 7 even punished in real life? At the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, tensions boiled over in a confrontation between anti-war activists and law enforcement that would become known as the Chicago 7 trial. But how much of what we saw in the Oscar-nominated film, The Trial of the Chicago 7, actually happened? We'll separate fact from fiction, uncovering the real events behind the dramatic courtroom scenes. So, to start with the most basic question, what were the Chicago 7 actually on trial for? The Chicago 7 were activists who got in trouble for their roles in the protests during the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The Chicago 7, originally the Chicago 8, were charged with crossing state lines with the intent to incite riots during the convention. They were allegedly in violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Other charges included impeding law enforcement officers and instructing others on making incendiary devices. The charges against the Chicago 7 stemmed from the volatile political climate of the 1960s and their efforts to protest the Vietnam War. Did the people protesting in Chicago actually break any laws? Yes, the protesters, including groups like the Youth International Party, Yippies, and the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, MOB, technically broke the law. They were only allowed to gather at the bandshell in Grant Park, but were denied permits to march toward the convention site or hold rallies in nearby parks. Despite this, they defied the restrictions and the park's 11 p.m. curfew, leading to clashes with the police. Speaking of which, let's dive into another controversial aspect of the protests. Did the protesters really climb up the hill and rush towards the police? No, it's not how it plays out in the movie. In reality, it was the other way around. The protesters first swarmed the statue of General John Logan at the top of the hill, waving flags and climbing onto the statue. It was only after this that the police arrived to clear the protesters from the hill and the statue. The movie makes it seem like the police were already positioned there before the protesters charged them. Little details like this can shape our perception of who the aggressors were in these clashes. Did a female undercover agent really seduce Jerry Rubin? No, the character of Agent Daphne Fitzgerald, who seduces Jerry Rubin in the movie, appears to be almost entirely fictional. There's no evidence that the real Jerry Rubin was ever seduced by a female undercover agent. This storyline was likely introduced to add some levity and drama to the film after Rubin discovers Daphne's true identity. But in reality, while there were undercover agents who infiltrated the protesters, none of them had a romantic subplot with Rubin. Was Jerry Rubin really arrested for trying to stop an attempted rape? No, there's no evidence to back that. The part where he rescues a female protester from aggressive fraternity brothers appears to be made up. In reality, Rubin was just arrested later by police on a Chicago street and put into an unmarked car. Now, let's look at another questionable portrayal in the movie. Were prosecutors really worried that including Bobby Seale in the trial would intimidate the jury because he's black? No. The more likely reasons were that Seale had given a speech calling for violence against police during the protests, and his status as the leader of the Black Panther Party made him a target for prosecution. While the movie implies a racist motive behind Seale's inclusion, the available information doesn't support that particular theory. His involvement seems to have been driven more by the nature of his actions and his high-profile position rather than an attempt to manipulate the jury. Did Black Panther co-founder Fred Hampton give advice to Bobby Seale during the trial? No, there's no record of Fred Hampton being present at the trial or giving advice to Bobby Seale. The appearance of Hampton in the movie was probably meant to hint at his tragic death by law enforcement, which then motivates Seale's defiance in court. However, there's no proof that such an encounter happened between them during the trial. Here's another interesting one. Did Judge Hoffman actually order Bobby Seale to be tied up and silenced in the courtroom? Yes, this actually happened. Judge Julius Hoffman ordered the bailiffs to bind, gag, and chain Bobby Seale to a chair in the courtroom due to his continuous disruptions. He called the judge a bigot, a racist, a fascist, and a pig. Seale remained restrained in this manner for 3 days, attempting to free himself while making muffled sounds. The judge justified this action by citing a Supreme Court precedent, allowing such measures to ensure trial proceedings could continue. Here's another thing the judge did, which is actually left out in the movie. Did Judge Hoffman require the defendants and their lawyers to trim their long hair? Yes, Judge Hoffman did order that the lengthy hair of the defendants and their lawyers be cut by barbers at the Cook County Jail. This detail was probably left out to prevent confusion among viewers who were already familiar with the characters. However, it's another example of the judge's strict enforcement of decorum in the courtroom, even extending to personal grooming. By not including this detail, the film might have missed a chance to show the cultural gap between Hoffman and the defendants. Did Tom Hayden really say to the crowd, if there's going to be violence, let it spread throughout the city? Yes, according to accounts from the time. Tom Hayden did make this inflammatory statement to a large crowd of protesters gathered at Grant Park on August 28, 1968, one of the peak days of violence during the convention week. Hayden's full quote included statements like, if blood is going to flow, let it flow all over the city. If gas is going to be used, let that gas come down all over Chicago. He urged protesters to turn this excited, overheated military machine against itself and leave the park in groups throughout the city. While the movie implies Hayden was just referring to the protesters' blood flowing and may have misspoken, the full context suggests he was indeed issuing a provocative call. Did two of the Chicago 7 really wear judges' robes when they entered the courtroom? Yes, this detail from the film accurately reflects real events. Defendants Bobby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin indeed entered the courtroom dressed in judicial robes, and then revealed police uniforms underneath by removing the robes. They also stepped on the robes, aiming to provoke the judge and disrupt the court's order and decorum. This act was one of many antics by the Chicago 7 to challenge Judge Hoffman's authority and mock the proceedings. Their actions, ranging from chanting to reading poetry, were calculated efforts to undermine the court's credibility. Did Tom Hayden read the names of soldiers who died in the Vietnam War while in court? No, it was actually fellow defendant Dave Dellinger, not Hayden, who read out the names of the fallen soldiers. And this occurred earlier in the trial on Moratorium Day, October 15, 1969, rather than at the end as depicted in the film. Before moving on to the next question, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Here's an interesting one. Did Dave Dellinger actually hit a bailiff? Well, this scene is fictionalized and does not match historical events. Dellinger, known for his pacifist beliefs and role as a Boy Scout leader, would not have acted against his principles of nonviolence in such a manner. Another intriguing scene was when the protesters, including Bobby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, march on police headquarters to get Tom Hayden out of jail. So, did that really happen? Yes, it actually did. They were met by an armed battalion of police officers outside the station, just as shown in the movie. And like in the film, Hayden was eventually released on bail after the standoff. It's a powerful scene that captures the escalating tensions between the two sides during that tumultuous period. But that brings up another very important question. Who was actually responsible for the violence, the protesters or the police? Well, it appears that both the police and the protesters were to some extent responsible. The movie portrays the police as the primary aggressors and the protesters as victims, which presents a somewhat one-sided view. In reality, while there were indeed reports of police overreaction and indiscriminate attacks, the protesters were not entirely innocent either. Some protesters threw objects like bottles, bricks, and even bags of urine and feces at the police. There are also reports of protesters punching and physically fighting with police, as well as causing damage to private businesses. How long did the Chicago 7 trial last? The Chicago 7 trial lasted almost 5 months, stretching from September 1969 to February 1970, with sentencing occurring on February 20th, 1970. Sitting through such a lengthy trial must have been incredibly challenging. But after enduring a long and tumultuous trial, what happened at the end? Were the Chicago 7 punished? Yes, despite being acquitted of the conspiracy charge, 5 of the 7 defendants, Tom Hayden, Bobby Hoffman, Rennie Davis, David Dellinger, and Jerry Rubin, were convicted of inciting riots and given 5-year prison sentences. The 7 men, along with their lawyers, also received hefty contempt of court sentences from Judge Hoffman. However, none of the defendants spent more than 3 years in prison, as the convictions were eventually overturned on appeal in 1972. The appeals court cited judicial and prosecutorial misconduct, including the judge's bias and the FBI's surveillance of the defense lawyers' offices. So, while the Chicago 7 initially faced punishment, their convictions did not ultimately hold up. The courts overturned them due to concerns about an unfair trial process influenced by both the judge and prosecutors. What aspect of the Chicago 7 trial surprised you the most? Was it the courtroom drama, the political tensions, or something else entirely? Let us know in the comments below. Subscribe and we'll catch you in the next episode of this exclusive debunking series.